When Abraham Lincoln was elected president in 1860, many Southerners feared that he would end slavery. Soon after the election, several Southern states seceded or left the Union. They formed the Confederate States of America. Lincoln and many others in the North did not think these states had a right to secede. But the president did not want to start a war. Then on April 12, 1861, Confederate guns began shelling Fort Sumter in the harbor of Charleston, South Carolina. After more than a day of shelling, the Union soldiers in the fort surrendered. After the fall of Fort Sumter, Lincoln called for the states to supply 75,000 soldiers to put down the rebellion. This call for troops convinced 4 other Southern states to secede. Volunteers began flocking into the armies of the North and South. The average age of these volunteers was in the early 20s. Many were just teenagers. The typical soldier was a farmer who had never been far from home. Life in the Union Army was not easy. The men wore dark blue uniforms made of wool, which was hot and uncomfortable in the warm summer. The uniforms often did not fit well since they came in only 2 sizes. Adding to the soldiers' burdens were the heavy knapsack, blanket, and rubber blanket they had to carry. They also had a haversack filled with a canteen, utensils, a frying pan, and food. For weapons, the Union soldiers carried a rifle, a few rounds of ammunition, and a bayonet. Some Southern soldiers did receive uniforms. Others simply wore their own clothes. Over time, these garments became very worn and tattered. Many soldiers did not even have shoes. For many Southern soldiers, their weapons were not as good as those of Union soldiers. They carried a rifle or a musket and ammunition boxes attached to their belts. They also carried canteens, haversacks, blankets, a small frying pan, and a tin cup. Soldiers in both armies ate similar food, which was poor. They relied on salted meat, hardtack, and coffee. Hardtack is a hard, dry cracker. These crackers were sometimes called tooth dullers or sheet iron crackers because they were so hard and unappetizing. Vegetables and fruit were scarce, and they were usually dried or canned. The soldiers got creative with their meals. Union soldiers made skilly-gally, which was salted pork mixed with crumbled hardtack and fried. Confederate soldiers created a dish called couche. They fried bacon and then added water and cornmeal to make a thick gravy-like substance. When they were in camp, the soldiers tended to eat better than when they were on the march. On the march, their rations were smaller because they could not carry much food. One advantage of marching was that soldiers could buy fresh food from the farms they passed or steal it. It was also a problem to find clean drinking water during the Civil War. The lack of a proper diet and clean water undoubtedly contributed to the poor health of many Civil War soldiers. Twice as many soldiers died of diseases such as dysentery, typhoid, and malaria than were killed in battle. When they were not fighting or marching, soldiers found various ways to keep themselves busy. Many soldiers read to pass the time. Harper's Weekly was a popular magazine. Soldiers also read religious periodicals and books sent by their families. Some played instruments to entertain their fellow soldiers. Soldiers would often sing songs together. They also played cards to keep themselves entertained. There were boxing matches, and they played a new sport, baseball. Many soldiers, including Union General Ulysses S. Grant, kept diaries. Nearly every soldier wrote letters to his loved ones. Getting a letter from a family member would boost their spirits. Still, homesickness and news of bad times at home caused some soldiers to desert, or at least to think about it. The soldiers also had duties to attend to in camp, like collecting firewood and clean water. digging toilets in fortifications, and performing guard duty. In camp, the soldiers awoke at 5 or 6 in the morning. After breakfast, they drilled to learn how to march and fight together. There were many of these drills held throughout the day. Life was much harder for soldiers when they were on the march. Marches lasted all day and covered up to 12 miles or so. In the summer heat, they choked from the dust. When it rained, the dirt roads turned to mud. When the Civil War broke out, both sides expected an early victory, but for many months neither North nor South could gain the upper hand. Finally, in the summer of 1863, the North won 2 important victories. Union General Ulysses S. Grant captured the key Confederate stronghold of Vicksburg, Mississippi. That victory gave the Union control of the Mississippi River and split the Confederacy. The other important Union victory came in the East at the Battle of Gettysburg in July 1863. The armies fought at Gettysburg, Pennsylvania for 3 days. This fighting destroyed 1/3 of Confederate Commander General Robert E. Lee's forces. He was forced to lead the remnants of his army back to the South. This marked Lee's last attempt to invade the North. Although Gettysburg was a turning point, the war continued for nearly 2 more years. On April 9, 1865, General Lee realized he could push his troops no further. He surrendered his army to General Grant at a Virginia farmhouse. The remaining Confederate troops surrendered by the end of May. The North had won the war, and the country would be profoundly changed. During the war, Lincoln had proclaimed freedom for enslaved African Americans living in the Confederacy. In December of 1865, the 13th Amendment was ratified. This amendment ended slavery throughout the United States. No longer could one person own another. But Lincoln was not alive to see that day. He had been shot and killed by John Wilkes Booth less than a week after Lee's surrender. More than 600,000 people died in the Civil War. That is more Americans than died in World Wars I and II, Korea, and Vietnam combined. Because of this terrible war, the Union was preserved, and all African Americans were free.
What hardships did soldiers in the Civil War face? Why is the Battle of Gettysburg considered a turning point in the Civil War?